When the assassination of the Austria-Hungarian Archduke set off the First World War in August of 1914, Africa was immediately dragged into the war. Britain, France, and Belgium worked together to overrun German colonies in West, East, and Southern Africa. In North Africa too, Britain's control of the Suez Canal was threatened by the Ottoman Empire. World War I had devastating economic and social consequences for colonial Africa. Politically, the war resulted in the intensification of colonial rule and a reassignment of colonial masters for the African people. This is a story about World War I, also known as the First World War, also known as the Great War. It's a story about how this war transpired on the African continent, but most importantly, how it affected the lives of the African societies that lived through it. At the outbreak of the war, the Allied forces launched an attack on Germany's African colonies. These were Togo and Cameroon in West Africa, Tanzania, Burundi, and Rwanda in East Africa, as well as German Southwest Africa, which is modern-day Namibia. The seizure of Togo was significant for the Allied powers because they managed to eliminate Germany's most important overseas wireless station in Kamina. What this did was to cut communication between the colonies and Berlin, as well as some of the German ships at sea. The Allied attack on Cameroon was not as easy as the one on Togo, but in 1915, a combined offensive by French and British troops led to the siege of Yaoundé by the British. As for German Southwest Africa, or Namibia, the Allied powers did not do the work themselves. At the request of the British government, South Africa's Union Defence Force launched an attack into German Southwest Africa and defeated the Germans, who surrendered in July 1915. The East Africa Campaign was the greatest of all of the First World War campaigns on the continent. The British sent an Indian expeditionary force led by Major General Aitken to launch an attack on Tanga, but the German troops, under the command of Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, put up a good fight. Following their defeat of German Southwest Africa, the South Africans joined the fighting in East Africa in 1915 and led the protracted campaign in that region. Many Africans participated in the war, either through conscription or recruitment by their colonial masters. For example, the King's African Rifles, which was the British colonial army in East Africa, started off with 2,319 men in 1914. By the end of the war in 1918, this number had grown to 31,000. And the British colonial army in West Africa, which was known as the Royal West African Frontier Force, managed to raise a total of 50,000 men from Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and the Gold Coast. Unlike the British, the French preferred to use colonial troops in the Western Front. To hold off German forces during the war, French President Clemenceau decided to use as many colonial troops as possible in the protection of the so-called motherland. There was actually a tendency by the French High Command to commit African troops to suicidal missions to avoid losing French lives. But in reality, African casualties were not that different from metropolitan French troops. By the end of the war, about 200,000 French West African troops had fought on the Western Front, and around 30,000 of them had died in the process. It's also important to point out that not all Africans who served in the First World War were soldiers. Most Africans who served in the war were actually porters and carriers, and in the East African campaign alone, there were close to 1 million of them recruited. Now, let's talk a little bit about the impact of the First World War on African societies. The war had significant political, social, and economic consequences for colonial Africa. The scorched earth tactics employed in the war led to the destruction of many villages and the death of African people. In East Africa alone, about 350,000 men, women and children died from famine and diseases. Africans' food supplies and labor were requisitioned by both sides of the war. In Nyasaland, for example, which is Malawi today, the colonial administration confiscated almost all cattle for the war effort. Between 1916 and 1917, all of Nyasaland's rice crop was used to feed the Allied forces. The recruitment and conscription of African men also undermined agricultural productivity. In the Congo, the Belgians intensified forced labor in 1916 for the East African Campaign. By the end of 1916, Eastern Congo had supplied more than 3 million days worth of porterage work, and over 3,359 of these porters were worked to death. As a reaction to the overwhelming pressures of the war and the weakening of colonial governments, some uprisings occurred in the colonies. In 1915, for example, there was an uprising in Nyasaland, which was led by an African Baptist minister by the name of John Chilembwe. Chilembwe had been very vocal about his displeasure with the rapid recruitment of Nyasaland men, the requisitioning of agricultural produce, as well as the hardships endured by the porters and carriers. Chilembwe's followers attacked and killed a white plantation manager, and given the wartime atmosphere, the British were very swift in putting an end to this uprising. In West Africa, the end of the war saw several uprisings like the 1918 Egba uprising in Nigeria. There were other subtle forms of resistance like the boycott by cocoa farmers in the Gold Coast as a reaction to low prices. In Portuguese East Africa, or Mozambique today, there was the Berua Rebellion of 1917, which was a reaction to the pressures and exploitation of the war. Because of the wartime uprisings, and by extension the war itself, colonial rule became intensified in Africa. The years between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War, which are also known as the interwar period, became what many people have called the high tide of colonialism, because the end of the First World War brought with it a new era of colonial consolidation. The end of the First World War resulted in the creation of the League of Nations. Under this organization, Germany was expelled from Africa, and her colonies were placed under the responsibility of Britain, France, Belgium, and South Africa as mandates. Let me wrap up by saying, if you've enjoyed this episode, be on the lookout for the next one, which will be focusing on World War II in Africa. As always, this has been Simon Bayani with Africa in Retrospect. Cheers for now.